Chapter 7, Lesson 2, Life in the South. What to know. How did plantations affect life in the southern colonies? Describe how slavery influenced daily life in the southern colonies. Identify ways in which slaves tried to deal with the hardships of their lives, enslaved people. Describe what government was like in the southern colonies. Explain the role that religion played in southern colonists' lives. You are there. The crowd that is gathered in the middle of the town's market square is looking at two people bound in shackles and standing on a platform. They were recently brought over from Africa on a slave ship and are about to be sold as slaves. You try to imagine how scared and heartbroken they must feel after having been taken so far away from their homes and families. Iron shackles like these were often used to bind the hands or feet of enslaved people. And some words to know that you'll see in Quizlet: institution, institutionalize, planter, overseer, people, Anthony Johnson, places, Spanish Florida, Fort Mose. Our first section, slavery and society. Set up your 2-column notes with this on the side, the left side. How did laws help institutionalize slavery? The first Africans most likely arrived in Virginia in 1619. Within a few years, traders from Europe and the West Indies brought thousands of enslaved Africans to the colonies. These Africans had been taken from their homes, chained together in ships, and sent to colonial cities to be sold. At first, Africans had been sold in the colonies as indentured servants. However, as the need for workers grew, assemblies began, lawmakers began to pass laws making slavery legal. So remember, an indentured servant can work for a period of time and then be free. And many poor white Europeans came as indentured servants and then earned freedom. So at first, Africans were indentured servants who could earn freedom. However, lawmakers began making laws that made it legal to have slavery, where you stay a slave. In time, slavery became institutionalized. It became part of life in the colonies. By the mid-1700s, slavery was legal in all 13 colonies. These laws said that the children of enslaved people were also slaves. As a result, families were often split up and sold to different owners. That's so sad. Many enslaved Africans ended up working on plantations in one of the southern colonies. By 1750, about 200,000 slaves lived in the region. The way slaves were treated varied. It differed with their owners. Slave owners were allowed by law to beat, whip, or insult slaves. Slaves had little hope of escape, and the law did not protect them. Slaves were not allowed to speak out against slavery, but they did not accept the system. Slaves often did whatever they could to resist, to act against slavery. They broke tools, pretended to be sick, or worked slowly. Such actions were dangerous, however, and slaves had to be careful to avoid punishment. Enslaved Africans tried to deal with the hardships of their lives. They preserved their culture by telling stories about Africa and by singing African songs. By the late 1700s, the Christian religion also became a source of strength for some slaves. And particularly the story of the slaves being freed from Egypt was a biblical lesson that resonated with these enslaved Africans. How did laws help institutionalize slavery? One way enslaved Africans preserved or saved their culture was through music. The gourd banjo is an instrument that was developed in Africa. This portrait shows an enslaved woman from South Carolina. Plantation Life. And here we have a 2-page spread. So let's look at what we can see there. Many plantations in the southern colonies were self-sufficient. That means the planters grew the food and skilled workers produced needed goods. So you had your candlestick maker, your mason, right? Everyone, all the skills were on a single plantation for the most part. So let's find this. We're going to find the fields, the overseer's house, the slave houses, the hospital, the kitchen, the planter's house. And again, how were they self-sufficient? Plantation life. Most slaves in the southern colonies lived and worked on plantations. Slave labor and cash crops such as tobacco and rice made some planters or plantation owners very rich. They became the richest people in the southern colonies. Not all plantation owners were alike. A few started as poor indentured servants who slowly bought more land and slaves. Others were wealthy English settlers who had been granted huge pieces of land by the king or by the royal governors. The first plantations were built along rivers on the coastal plain. The rivers provided a way to ship cash crops to port cities. Remember the middle colonies, how important the port cities were of Philadelphia and New York? By 1750, settlers had moved farther west and they had started large plantations there. As planters grew richer, the amount of land they owned also grew. Some plantations looked like small villages. The main building on a plantation was the planter's house, which was often 2 or 3 stories high. Slaves usually helped build these large homes. In general, there were 2 kinds of slaves: field slaves and house slaves. Field slaves worked in the fields, raising crops such as tobacco, rice, and sugar cane. House slaves worked in the planter's home. Many buildings surrounded the planter's home. Some were workshops, where slaves made nails, bricks, barrels, and other items used on the plantation. The kitchen wasn't a building by itself. Wealthy plantation owners hired overseers to watch the field slaves as they worked. The overseer's house was often near the planters, but slave houses were usually far from the planter's house. A typical slave home was a one-room wooden building. Near their homes, some slaves kept small gardens, which they tended after working the planter's land. Most planters did not work in the fields, but they did have many responsibilities. Running a plantation was like managing a small town and a business at the same time. Planters had to provide food and housing for everyone on the plantation. Besides taking care of the plantation, a planter's duties included public service or working for the community. Planters often served as judges or members of the colonial assembly, the lawmakers. Some planters served as advisors to the governor. Because plantations were far apart, there were few schools. Instead, planters hired private tutors for their children. The tutors often lived and taught on the plantation. However, enslaved children were not allowed to receive an education. And how were the plantations like small villages? Reenactors show how people on small farms prepared fields for planting. And let's set up our notes. Left side of your 2-column notes, life on small farms. What was life like on small farms? How did most Southern colonists make their living on small farms? So we're comparing this to plantations or what the very, very rich people had. Just your average colonist, though, they did not have that. They had small farms. Much of the Southern economy depended on large plantations. However, most Southern colonists lived and worked on small farms. They planted and harvested their own crops. And these were often former indentured servants. Former indentured servants often became owners of small farms. Unlike planters, few became wealthy. So they basically just made it. They didn't ever become wealthy. They just got by. Many families on small farms lived in one-story houses. Their children slept up in a loft where goods were stored. During the 1600s, most families on small farms owned little furniture other than beds. By the middle of the 1700s, some farmers were a little better off. They were able to buy cushions for their hard wooden chairs. Some even bought glass mirrors and china plates. People on small farms often lived far from each other. As a result, church services were both a religious and social event for people on small farms. Parents discussed news while children played together. Poor farm families looked forward to church days. Some families traveled for hours to reach the closest church. People on small farms did not usually own slaves. People on small farms did not usually own slaves. Those who did rarely owned more than one or two. Slaves and owners lived and worked close together, but slaves were still not treated as equals. Some colonists thought slavery was wrong, but it continued because plantation owners claimed they depended on the work of enslaved Africans. So how did most Southern colonists make their living? And I want to point this out. Even though some colonists thought slavery was wrong, it continued because plantation owners claimed they depended on the work of enslaved Africans. And remember this, the planters also worked as judges or members of the lawmaking groups. and advisors to the governor. So they had power over laws that were passed. Okay, I think this is our last section. Yes. Okay. On the left side of your 2-column notes, free Africans or freed Africans. How were some Africans in the southern colonies able to become free? What can I learn about freed Africans in the southern colonies? Let's read. Not all enslaved Africans in the southern colonies remained slaves. Some found ways to escape, and others were able to buy their freedom. However, it was difficult to escape from slavery. Some free Africans were able to buy land and start their own farms. During the 1640s, a former slave named Anthony Johnson bought land in Virginia. Johnson soon became a wealthy tobacco planter. He even bought an enslaved African named Caesar, or Caesar, I'm not sure. A former slave became free and then he bought a slave. Whoa. A few other free Africans were also wealthy enough to buy slaves. Most did not want to be part of a system of slavery. However, some free Africans did buy enslaved relatives in order to free them. That makes sense. Few slaves were lucky enough to be set free. Instead, they risked their lives to run away from their owners. Runaway slaves were often captured and returned to their owners. Those who were not captured often found help in Spanish Florida or from American Indian tribes. So those who were not captured also often found help in Spanish Florida or from American Indian tribes. As slaves escaped to Spanish Florida, the Seminole Indians provided food and shelter. Runaway slaves were given land on which to grow crops, and in return, they agreed to give 1/3 of their crops to the Indians. These former slaves often dressed like Seminoles and learned the Seminole language. In time, they became known as the Black Seminoles. Other free Africans in Spanish Florida started their own communities. In 1738, a new town for free Africans was settled. Florida's governor decided to set up a town called Fort Mose. I was saying it Mose, but it's Mose. This was the first settlement in North America for free Africans. While living in Spanish Florida, the people of Fort Mose were able to practice their African ways. And in summary, life in the southern colonies was full of contrasts. Plantation owners were very rich, but they depended on the work of enslaved Africans. On small farms, many former indentured servants lived in poverty. Not all Africans were enslaved. Some bought their freedom or escaped. And here is some information on Fort Mose. In 1738, the Spanish governor of Florida set up the town of Fort Mose for free Africans. The governor hoped the settlement would help protect St. Augustine, the town, from English attacks. In many ways, the town of Fort Mose was like other Spanish towns. The African settlers of Fort Mose were loyal to Spain. They formed a military unit that fought beside Spanish soldiers and helped defend St. Augustine. And questions to go over for discussion.